Her daughter shoved her aside, in church, during the Mother's Day service. Fran Holloway, retired librarian and widow, didn't protest. Melinda, her only child, smiled for the camera and called it family. By evening, her name was gone. From the will, the deed, and every account she'd once claimed as hers. Fran had spent a lifetime giving her everything. Now she was taking back her peace. And when they learned what she'd done, the papers would speak louder than forgiveness. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The scent of fresh flowers hung in the air, mingling with the faint hum of whispered prayers. The church, with its stained glass windows casting hues of blue and gold across the pews, felt like a sanctuary to Fran. She had come here for decades, ever since her late husband Henry had carried her over the threshold as a newlywed, and later had held their daughter, Melinda, in his arms for the first time. The same place where she had rocked Chloe to sleep as a baby during long Sunday services, and where she had learned to cherish every quiet, sacred moment. This Mother's Day service was supposed to be just like every other. Simple, unremarkable, a blessing for the women who had borne the weight of family. But when the pastor, a man who had known Fran for years, called out to her, asking her to stand for a group blessing, something felt off. She rose, carefully, as always, a dignified woman of 72, no longer spry in the way she once had been, but steady in her bearing. Her hair, once chestnut brown, was now a soft, dignified silver, her dress understated, a simple floral pattern with a modest collar. The hem of her skirt brushed against the worn carpet as she made her way toward the altar. The congregation, as usual, watched the quiet ritual with reverence. But Fran had never cared for attention. She didn't need applause, just the sense of peace that came with being in the moment, among the faithful. That peace shattered when Melinda, her daughter, darted forward, all clattering heels and a bright, practiced smile. She squeezed past Fran with barely a glance, as though she were a piece of furniture to navigate around. Fran's chest tightened. For a moment she was caught in the motion, her feet stumbling slightly on the thick carpet. A couple of heads turned, eyes wide. Her eyes flicked to Chloe, seated at the back. The teenager's gaze locked with hers for a moment, so quick, so telling. The flash of guilt in Chloe's expression was gone as quickly as it came, but it was there. For just a second, it felt as if Chloe had seen her, had seen the reality of the shove Melinda had given her, not just physically, but emotionally. Melinda's sharp, calculated voice broke through the tension. "Not right now, Mom." She was already positioning herself in front of the pastor, eager to capture the perfect family photo for the world to see. Fran had never liked the way Melinda treated these moments as performances. Melinda was always playing the role of a doting daughter when it suited her, but this was different. There was no pretense of affection here, just a cold dismissal. The flash of the camera went off just as Fran stood there, on the edge of the group, ignored. She felt the sting of the light more than she had ever felt in her life. The bright burst illuminated the gap between her and the family, a silent testimony to her absence. Melinda's arm slid around the pastor's shoulders, her face radiant, her smile carefully curated. She turned, half facing the camera, while Fran was still lingering in the periphery, forgotten in the background. The photo would show only Melinda, Greg standing dutifully beside her, and the pastor, all framed neatly in a moment of manufactured happiness. Fran wasn't even a blur at the edge of the image. She was invisible, and that, perhaps, hurt the most. As the camera flashed again, Fran took a half step backward, her feet heavy, the weight of years pressing down on her. She felt foolish. She didn't belong there. The moments that had once held meaning to her, the simple Sundays, the quiet blessings, the times when her family was truly hers, felt more like echoes of a distant time. Her daughter had turned her into nothing more than an accessory to her own image. Later, Fran would see the post, her daughter's carefully curated caption, "Generational strength, cash blessed," pinned beneath the photo like a polished layer of artifice. There was no mention of the woman who had raised her, no acknowledgement of the sacrifice it took to build a family. Just a sanitized image of Melinda's perfect life, a life in which Fran was merely a prop. She didn't need to look at it again. Fran knew enough to not let herself sink into that void of need for validation. But Chloe saw. Chloe always did. And Fran could feel the weight of that look in her granddaughter's eyes, the understanding that what had just happened was wrong, even if she couldn't voice it. As the service continued, Fran's mind wandered far from the hymns. She remembered the times Melinda had been a little girl, her face lit up with innocence, her laughter a soundtrack to their lives. She remembered the moments when her daughter had needed her, and how she had never hesitated to give everything, to be everything. But somewhere along the way, Melinda had changed. Or maybe it was Fran who had changed. She wasn't sure anymore. The moment the service ended, the quiet stir of people filing out of the pews felt deafening. Fran lingered, her hand resting on the back of the pew in front of her, as if holding herself upright. The chatter around her felt like a blur, the familiar voices no longer as comforting as they once had been. She would leave, but not for Melinda. Not anymore. Outside, the bright sun of the early afternoon shone down on the parking lot. But for Fran, it felt like the light had dimmed just a little more. Fran stood still for a moment in the kitchen. The low hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the old grandfather clock, the only sounds in the house. The sunlight streamed through the window above the sink, casting a warm glow across the kitchen table. It was the kind of light that made everything seem a little more real, a little more permanent. But Fran's hands shook slightly as she reached for the cabinet above the sink, pulling down the estate folder she had kept hidden there for years. She had never needed to open it. Not until now. The folder was thick, its edges worn from use, the leather binding cracked in a few places. Inside, it held all the pages that outlined the careful structure of her life's work. Her house, her savings, her art collection, her jewelry, everything she had accumulated and held dear. It had all been meant to pass to her daughter, Melinda, her only child, the one she had raised with every ounce of love and devotion. But now, as her fingers flipped through the pages, the numbers and names blurred. The ink seemed darker somehow. She paused at the asset distribution page, where Melinda's name was written in neat, professional script. It was the last name on the list, the one she had trusted. Fran felt her jaw tighten as she picked up the pen, its familiar weight in her hand now feeling foreign, like a tool of war rather than one of care. Slowly, deliberately, she drew a line through Melinda's name. There was no hesitation, no guilt. Just the sharp sound of ink scratching paper. The name, once a symbol of familial bond, now felt like a betrayal etched in black. Fran knew there would be no going back. She could almost hear Melinda's voice in her mind, pleading for forgiveness, for understanding. But it was too late for that. Melinda had shown her true colors today, and Fran had seen enough. She wasn't a fool. This wasn't just about the photo. It was about the years of disregard, the years of turning a blind eye to how she had been treated, like a secondary character in her own life. As she crossed out Melinda's name, a soft vibration broke her thoughts. Fran glanced down at her phone. A text from Chloe. "I saw what happened. I'm sorry, Grandma." Fran closed her eyes, feeling a weight settle in her chest. She could feel the ache of Chloe's sincerity, the way the girl had looked at her with those wide, innocent eyes, the unspoken message behind them. Chloe had seen what Melinda had done. Chloe had seen how her mother had shoved Fran aside, as if she didn't matter. Fran typed her response, her fingers moving slowly across the screen. Not your burden, sweetheart. She hit send, her gaze lingering on the screen for a moment longer than necessary. Chloe was too young for this. But Fran was certain Chloe understood the cost of love. She wouldn't let her granddaughter be dragged into this mess, not when she was the only one who still seemed to care. The phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Chloe. It was Ellie. Is Raymond still your estate guy? Fran smiled softly, the question feeling like a lifeline in the sea of emotions that threatened to drown her. Raymond Dorsey had been Ellie's lawyer for years, and Fran had always trusted him. He was meticulous, quiet, and utterly loyal. He would handle this with the precision Fran needed. He never stopped being mine. You want sharp or surgical? Ellie's text came back quickly, the bluntness of it familiar and comforting. Fran put the phone down, her mind already working, calculating the next steps. She couldn't afford to waste time. There was no room for hesitation. Her will would be rewritten, completely, and with intention. She wouldn't allow her daughter to take another step in her life without understanding the consequences of her actions. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the phone again. She called Ellie, the line ringing once, twice, before Ellie picked up. Fran, Ellie said, her voice low and steady. You ready? I'm ready, Fran replied, her voice resolute. Ellie paused, then asked, Sharp or surgical? Fran didn't need to think. Surgical, she said firmly. I need it to be clean. There was a brief silence on the other end. Fran could almost hear Ellie's nod, even though they weren't in the same room. Ellie knew what this meant. She understood the weight of Fran's words. I'll handle it, Ellie said quietly. I'll let Raymond know. Fran hung up the phone and turned back to the estate folder. She reached for the pen again, poised over the paper. The decision had been made. The path was set, and there would be no turning back. In the silence that followed, Fran felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. It wasn't the calm of acceptance, nor the calm of defeat. It was the calm of someone who had finally regained control. The kind of calm that came from knowing she was no longer a pawn in someone else's game. She took a deep breath, then began to write. The office of Raymond Dorsey was a world of muted leather chairs, dark wood, and cold metal filing cabinets that hummed with the weight of legal history. The faint scent of cigar smoke lingered in the corners, a reminder of the days when Raymond's father had run the practice. Now, Raymond sat at the desk, his glasses perched low on his nose, his fingers steepling as he glanced up at Fran. His calm demeanor was always a contrast to her stormy resolve. It was why she trusted him. Fran sank into the chair opposite him, the familiar creak of the leather offering no comfort. Her hands, still trembling slightly from the act of crossing out Melinda's name, folded tightly in her lap. She had walked through the streets of her neighborhood for hours before coming here, clearing her head, trying to breathe in the air of finality. But every step only made the weight of her decision heavier. Raymond's voice broke the silence, low and measured. Fran, still lists your daughter as primary beneficiary. He didn't need to elaborate. The words were simple enough. They both knew what that meant. But Fran had made her choice, and there was no turning back. It no longer reflects my intentions, Fran replied, her voice steady. It was the first time she had spoken those words aloud, and they felt like a declaration. She had spent her entire life nurturing her daughter, shaping her, believing in the bond between them. Now, that bond was a fragile thread, one she had severed with a simple stroke of a pen. Raymond didn't speak at first, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered her words. He had seen this before, the quiet rebellion of a woman who had reached the edge of patience. He was no stranger to the emotional toll these decisions took on his clients, but Fran's calm, resolute demeanor was something new. She wasn't angry. She was simply done. Done with the games. Done with the pretense. She had given enough. He pushed a fresh sheet of paper across the desk toward her, the pen waiting in his hand. "Understood," he said. His voice was not one of surprise or judgment, just the quiet professionalism that Fran had come to expect from him. "We'll make sure the amendment reflects that." Fran took the pen, her fingers brushing the cool metal. She had drafted her will years ago with the thought that it was a shield for her family, a final gesture of love and protection. But now it felt like a weapon she would wield with surgical precision. As Raymond began to draft the amendment, Fran leaned forward and slid a photo across the desk, the glossy surface catching the dim light from the desk lamp. Raymond glanced at it, his brow furrowing as he took in the image. It was a simple snapshot, a single frame from a moment that should have been one of unity and honor. Instead, it was a stark reminder of everything Fran had lost. Raymond's fingers paused midair. His eyes flicked back to Fran, a slight raise of his brow the only indication of his thoughts. "Message received," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. Fran didn't respond. She didn't need to. The photo spoke for itself. A moment of family. A moment where she had been shoved aside, erased from the narrative in front of the congregation. A prop. She could still feel the sting of the flash, the coldness of Melinda's voice, the look in Chloe's eyes. The anger had subsided into something quieter now, something more calculated. Raymond turned his attention back to the paperwork, his fingers flying over the keys of the typewriter as he began to amend the will. Fran watched him, her mind already racing ahead to the next steps. She had already decided that Melinda would be cut out completely, but there were still other matters to consider. Chloe, Ellie. There would be those who would need to be protected, and others, those who had failed her, that would be left with nothing. A draft of the amendment appeared in front of her, the names and numbers neatly typed, awaiting her signature. But Fran didn't reach for it yet. Instead, she sat back, the weight of the room settling in around her. "You'll be sure," she said, her voice low, "that this will hold up?" Raymond met her gaze, his face betraying no hint of doubt. "I'll make sure of it." Fran nodded. There was no room for uncertainty anymore. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She had lived her life by the rules, giving everything for her family, for the people who claimed to love her. Now, she would rewrite the rules. The legacy she had created would no longer belong to those who had turned their backs on her. It would belong to those who still understood what it meant to honor the bonds of family. She took the pen in hand, her fingers steady now, and signed the document with a flourish. Her eyes lingered on the lines of text. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of satisfaction. This was justice. This was retribution. But as she finished signing, the door to Raymond's office opened with a soft creak. Fran's hand froze mid-motion. The slight sound felt like a distant echo, reverberating in the silence of the room. Raymond didn't look up. He simply asked, "Can I help you?" The figure that stepped into the doorway was not someone Fran had expected. The old dining table was set with careful precision, as it always had been. Linen napkins, freshly pressed. China plates, polished to a subtle gleam. The sunlight that poured through the kitchen window painted everything with a soft glow, as if the house itself had held its breath for the past few hours. Fran moved around the table slowly, placing glasses of lemonade in front of each chair, her movements deliberate, as though she could somehow keep the world at bay by organizing the little details. Ellie, Chloe, and two of Fran's oldest friends, Dorothy and Mildred, had arrived on time, as they always did. The soft chatter of their voices filled the house, but it was a quiet, careful kind of noise. The kind of noise that happened when people knew something had changed, but no one was willing to say it outright. Dorothy, sitting across from Fran, smiled at her in that familiar, knowing way, as though she had already read the unspoken words. Mildred, perched on the edge of her seat as usual, seemed distracted, flicking glances between Fran and Chloe. But no one spoke about the events at church. The push, the photo, the way Melinda had walked away, leaving Fran behind like an afterthought. Fran busied herself with the silverware, rearranging it just slightly, a subtle gesture to hide the tightness in her chest. The silence at the table wasn't uncomfortable, but it was full of unsaid things. Every one of them had witnessed what had happened at the church, the way Fran had been brushed aside like a prop. But they were all too polite, too careful to mention it. They had seen it. They didn't need to talk about it. Chloe shifted in her seat, the sound of her chair scraping against the floor almost too loud in the quiet room. She leaned forward, her eyes searching Fran's face as though she were trying to find the words to fill the space between them. "You didn't deserve that," Chloe said quietly, her voice carrying a weight far beyond her 17 years. The words cut through the quiet like a knife, honest and raw. Fran looked at her granddaughter, her heart swelling with something that could have been pride if it weren't for the ache that twisted in her chest. Chloe's words were simple, but they were the truth. And that, more than anything, was what hurt the most. The truth had never been harder to accept. Fran took a long, slow breath, her gaze never leaving Chloe's face. She smiled gently, the kind of smile that was almost sad, but still warm. "That's the only thing I've raised worth inheriting," she replied softly, her voice steady but layered with meaning. The words felt heavier than Fran had expected them to. She had given everything to Melinda. Everything. And yet, it was Chloe, the one who had never once treated her like a burden, the one who saw her for who she truly was, who would inherit everything. Not just the house or the heirlooms, but the dignity that Fran had fought to keep all these years. The dignity that had been stripped away in front of the congregation. Dorothy let out a soft laugh, and for a moment the tension in the room lifted, replaced by the gentle warmth of old friends. "Well, at least you've got that. The rest is just things," she said, clinking her glass of lemonade with Mildred's. Mildred, nodding along, added, "Things can always be replaced, but not that kind of strength." Fran's lips tightened into a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of her glass, the coolness of it grounding her. She didn't need to hear the platitudes, didn't need to be told how strong she was. What she needed was something simpler. A quiet acknowledgement, a moment of peace. Ellie, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "You've made the right choice, Fran," she said, her voice firm but kind. "Chloe deserves this. She deserves everything you can give her." Fran nodded slowly, but she wasn't entirely sure she agreed. Could Chloe, with all her youth and innocence, carry the weight of everything Fran had built? Would she even want to? The legacy, the burdens of the past, the fractured relationships that had left scars in their wake. Could Chloe truly understand what was at stake? "I've updated Raymond," Fran said, her voice breaking the silence. "Chloe will be the primary heir. The conditions are simple. She'll inherit everything when she's 25, or when she marries, whichever comes first." A wave of emotion washed over her, something between pride and sorrow. She had spent so many years trying to protect Melinda, trying to build a future for her. And now, here she was, making sure that Chloe would never feel the sting of being invisible in her own family. The terms felt right, fair, but they didn't erase the ache in her chest. Chloe, who had been silent for a moment, looked up at Fran, her eyes clear and determined. "I'll make sure it's worth it, Grandma," she said, her voice unwavering. Fran reached out then, her hand resting on Chloe's, the warmth of her touch a silent promise. "I know you will, sweetheart." As they raised their glasses to toast, the lemonade shimmering in the light, Fran's heart felt heavy, yet strangely light at the same time. She had made her choice. There was no turning back now. The path ahead was set, but as the glasses clinked together, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a knock. It was a sudden, insistent ring. Too loud, too abrupt. Fran's hand froze mid-motion. Her eyes flicked to the door, her stomach tightening. She had a feeling she knew exactly who it was. Fran sat across from Raymond in his office once more, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound between them. It was quieter now, a sense of finality hanging in the air, heavier than the walls lined with dusty legal books and neatly stacked files. Raymond had worked with Fran for years. He had witnessed the ebb and flow of her life, her marriage to Henry, the birth of Melinda, the years spent shaping their family, only to watch it fray and unravel at the edges. But today, she was different. Today, Fran was no longer the dutiful mother or wife, the woman who gave everything without question. Today, she was something else entirely. The final draft of the will lay before her, crisp and precise, each line a testament to the irrevocable changes she had made. Raymond's pen hovered over it, ready to finalize, ready to seal the fate of her family. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. Melinda and Greg are removed. Fully, Raymond said, his voice low and measured. The words had an edge to them, as though he understood the weight of them just as well as Fran did. Fran's gaze flicked to the names on the document, the ones she had once trusted more than anything. Melinda and Greg, her daughter and son-in-law, had once been the center of her world, but now they were nothing more than names crossed out, erased from the future she had built. Fran's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. She had been forced to draw a line, but the pain of it still lingered in her chest like a dull ache. She nodded, her mouth dry as she watched Raymond make the necessary marks. It wasn't that she had hated them, not entirely. Melinda was her blood, her flesh. She had spent years loving her, guiding her, believing in the bond between them. But love had its limits, and Melinda had shattered whatever was left of theirs with a single, careless shove. It was the cruelty of the gesture at church, the way she had made Fran feel invisible, the way she had ignored the years of sacrifice and love. Fran's eyes flicked to the next line, the one where Chloe's name appeared. This was what mattered. This was where everything had shifted. Chloe receives everything, Fran murmured. The words felt right, yet there was something almost surreal about them. This young girl, who had not asked for any of this responsibility, would now inherit everything. The house, the money, the keepsakes, every bit of it. But only when she turned 25 or married, whichever came first. Raymond paused, his fingers hovering over the document. "Are you sure about the age-based condition?" he asked, his gaze lifting to meet hers. Fran's answer was immediate, unshaken. "She'll need to be able to carry this legacy, not just hold it. When she's ready, when she understands what this really means, then she can take it." The condition wasn't meant to be cruel. It was meant to give Chloe the time to grow into her inheritance, to not rush into it as if it were a burden. Chloe had always been the one who treated Fran like a person, not a shadow. She deserved to be protected from Melinda's legacy, from the coldness that had marked their family. Raymond nodded slowly, then continued typing, the rhythmic clicking of the keys a steady background to Fran's thoughts. She had once been so sure that Melinda would carry on her legacy. Now it was Chloe who would bear that mantle. There was more to the will. Much more. Fran wasn't finished. She slid another document across the table, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. "I want to donate $10,000 to the church's youth fund, in Chloe's name only." Raymond's eyebrow raised, but his expression remained calm. "A donation? In Chloe's name? Not in yours?" Fran's gaze hardened slightly. "In Chloe's name. Not mine. I've given enough. The church can have this. as a way to make sure the next generation is given something I never had, a chance to be seen for who they truly are. Not just as a part of someone's image, but for their own worth. The weight of her words settled heavily in the room. Fran had been a part of that church for years, attending services every Sunday, sitting in the back row with her husband, her daughter beside her. She had built something there, a quiet sense of community, of belonging. But now, with Melinda gone from her life, she wanted that connection to be about something real, something that would last beyond her own life. Raymond set down his pen, his gaze thoughtful. "It will be done, Fran," he said quietly. "You've made sure this will stand." She nodded once, and there was a quiet sense of finality between them. This was it. The last of her decisions had been made. The future she had once dreamed of was gone, but in its place was something stronger, something real. It was her choice, her will, her legacy. Fran leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "Ellie will be the executor. She's trusted. She'll do it the way I want it done." Raymond's fingers moved again, typing the final line, confirming Ellie's name. "Understood. It'll be done." The door to the office opened then, the soft creak of the hinges punctuating the silence. Fran's heart skipped a beat as she glanced toward the doorway, her stomach tightening with the sudden rush of uncertainty. Standing in the doorway was someone Fran had not expected to see today. The soft hum of the air conditioning filled the silence in Fran's living room, but the atmosphere was anything but cool. The table was set with meticulous precision, fresh white linen, fine china gleaming in the morning light, and croissants artfully arranged in a basket at the center. A photographer stood at the ready, camera slung over his shoulder, waiting for the perfect shot. His presence as unwelcome as the message behind it. Fran's eyes flicked to the man, his eagerness obvious even in his stillness, and then to Melinda, who was standing by the window, adjusting a vase of flowers. Everything was staged. It wasn't about family. It wasn't about reconciliation. This was about creating an image, a moment that could be carefully curated for social media, a lie wrapped in the thin veil of family healing. Melinda's smile was polished, practiced, as though she'd spent hours perfecting it in front of a mirror. The soft lighting cast a glow on her, but it couldn't mask the coldness behind her eyes, the same coldness that had been there when she'd elbowed past Fran in church. When the doorbell had rung that morning, Fran had known what was coming. Melinda had called last night, her voice syrupy sweet, but with an underlying edge. "I think it's time we have that family reconciliation brunch. Don't you think, Mom?" Fran hadn't responded, but she'd known it was only a matter of time before Melinda would appear, trying to repair the damage. Repair the damage, or try to make it look like they could pretend it hadn't happened. The brunch was exactly what Fran expected. Melinda stood poised, wearing a dress that was too bright for this somber gathering, and Greg hovered behind her, as usual, a man of few words, content to let his wife take the lead. They were the perfect image of a family trying to piece themselves together for an audience that wasn't really there, for an audience of followers on Melinda's Instagram account to be seen as a picture of normalcy. "I'm so glad you could make it," Melinda said, her voice high-pitched, a little too eager. She didn't hug Fran, of course. That would have been too personal, too intimate. Instead, she offered a brief touch on the arm, the kind of gesture that didn't require any real emotion. "I wouldn't miss it," Fran replied, her tone cool but controlled. Her eyes skimmed over the room, over the glass pitchers of orange juice, the coffee cups with carefully folded napkins beneath them, all arranged just so. It was a carefully constructed illusion, and Fran knew it. She knew what this was about. When they all sat down, the photographer began snapping pictures, the flashes like little bursts of sharp light, making Fran's head ache. She didn't mind the photos. What she minded was what they represented. The pretense, the image of a happy family that had never really existed in this way. It wasn't the family she had raised. "We all get emotional on stage," Melinda said as she sat down, casually tucking a lock of hair behind her ear. She glanced at Fran and then quickly looked away, her smile still fixed in place. "You understand, right?" Fran took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I understand everything now." There was no bitterness in her voice, just clarity. The truth had arrived like a long-buried skeleton finally clawing its way out of the closet. Fran had spent years trying to protect Melinda, to nurture the illusion that they were a family. But that was all it had been, an illusion. Greg, clearly uncomfortable in the spotlight, cleared his throat and tried to break the tension with a joke. "Well, I guess this is what they call family bonding, huh?" His words were awkward, and the silence that followed made the air feel thick, suffocating. He shot a glance at Fran, expecting her to laugh, to give him something that said this was okay, but she didn't. Fran's eyes remained steady on the croissants in front of her, her fingers brushing against one as if it were the only real thing on the table. "No one's laughing," Melinda said, her voice laced with irritation as she tried to fill the silence with her smile. Fran's gaze drifted toward the window. Outside, the garden had grown wild with roses and ivy, but it looked different now. It was untamed, unkept. It wasn't what it had once been, and neither was she. Neither was this family. She picked up a scone, took a bite. The lemony sweetness did little to lift the heaviness in her chest. "I'm not hungry," she said softly, setting the plate aside. The photographer, sensing the awkwardness, snapped a few more pictures, but his energy had dropped. The smile on Melinda's face faltered just for a fraction of a second. It was a crack in the facade. It would be gone before anyone noticed, but Fran saw it. She saw the vulnerability Melinda had worked so hard to hide. Fran stood, slow and deliberate. "I think I've had enough for today," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. She turned to the door, her hand brushing the frame as she stepped into the hallway. Behind her, she could hear Melinda's voice, trying to rally the conversation, trying to hold the picture of the perfect family together, but it was too late. She had already walked away. As Fran reached the door, the weight of the past few weeks, the weight of everything Melinda had taken from her, settled over her like a cloak. But she didn't look back. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds. A storm was coming. Fran could feel it. But this time, it wouldn't pass her by. She would make sure of it. And then, the doorbell rang. The phone rang 3 times, each buzz cutting through the stillness of Fran's home like a knife through the fabric of her resolve. She was standing by the kitchen counter, her hands resting on the smooth surface as she stared at the half-mixed batter in the bowl. The recipe for lemon bars was familiar, comforting, the ritual of it grounding her in a way that nothing else had been able to lately. It was the kind of thing she had done countless times, mixing ingredients, feeling the weight of the eggs crack beneath her fingers, the sugar pouring in like a promise of sweetness to come. But today, the act felt hollow, a small ritual in the midst of a world that was suddenly too loud, too bright, too much. The phone buzzed again, a vibration so sharp that it made the bowl tremble slightly. Melinda's name flashed across the screen, her call filling the air with something familiar, something unwanted. Fran stared at the phone for a moment, the sound of the call becoming a faint echo in the back of her mind. 3 calls in quick succession, 3 desperate attempts to reach her. She let it ring. It wasn't the first time Melinda had tried to repair things with a phone call. It wasn't the first time Fran had been ignored either, but this was different. Melinda's urgency, the way she had dropped all pretense, said it all. It wasn't about family now. It was about control. The phone vibrated again. A voicemail. Greg's voice, strained and soft, filtered through the speaker. "She's spiraling," he said. "Please call her." Fran let the message hang in the air for a moment, a quiet laugh bubbling up from somewhere deep within her. Spiraling. It was a word that had been used for years, a word that was always meant for someone else. Someone weaker, someone smaller. But it wasn't her. Not this time. She had made her choice. She had drawn the line. She let out a slow breath, her hands steady as she resumed stirring the batter. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and comfort, had turned into something else today. A space where she had to remind herself not to crumble under the weight of what Melinda had done, and what Melinda was now asking for. Too late for apologies, Fran thought. The phone buzzed again, a final attempt. Fran didn't even bother to glance at the screen this time. She didn't need to. She had heard it all before. The fake remorse, the rehearsed words, the promises. Too late. She thought again, her fingers tightening around the handle of the wooden spoon. Ellie's voice cut through the noise in her mind, clear and steady, the way only Ellie's voice could be. Block her until the funeral, then block her again. Fran's lips pressed into a thin line. Ellie's words, though harsh, were true. There would be no softening this time. No room for sentiment. Melinda had erased her once, and now it was time to erase Melinda from her life in return. With a quick flick of her wrist, Fran picked up the phone and swiped it across the screen. The call was blocked, her finger pressing the button with a finality that left her heart oddly light, even though she knew the consequences would come. She had already made her peace with that. The kitchen clock ticked louder, a reminder of the time that was slipping away. A lifetime of memories with Melinda, memories that had once been built on love, now reduced to fragments of bitter, silent truth. Fran turned her attention back to the counter, kneading the dough as if trying to force something pure out of it. Her hands moved methodically, feeling the texture of the flour and sugar, each motion a small rebellion against the chaos that had been set into motion. The lemon bars would be for the women's circle at church, her sanctuary, her place of quiet respect, far from the madness Melinda had brought into her life. The phone buzzed again, but this time, it was a text. Chloe. Her granddaughter's name flashed on the screen, and Fran's chest tightened as she read the message. "You didn't deserve to be shoved." Fran's eyes blurred for a moment. The ache of those words felt like a physical thing, a weight pushing against her chest. It wasn't just the sympathy. It was the understanding in Chloe's voice, the way she saw the truth without needing to be told. Chloe hadn't been there at the church, but somehow she knew. She had seen the hurt in Fran's eyes and had recognized it for what it was. Fran typed her response slowly, each word feeling like it carried more weight than it should. "I didn't deserve to be ignored." She hit send and put the phone down, turning back to the counter, the smell of lemon and butter filling the air. The kitchen, with its familiar warmth, began to feel like home again, a place where the world outside could no longer touch her. But as she pulled the pan from the oven and let the sweet, tangy scent waft through the room, a thought lingered in her mind. This was only the beginning. The storm that had been building inside her would not pass. It would sweep everything in its path, and nothing, not even Melinda, would be left untouched. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue over the garden, the light softened by the tall, overgrown vines that clung to the fence. The scent of earth and growing things filled the air, a subtle fragrance that comforted Fran as she knelt by the rose bushes. She wasn't sure how long she had been out there. Time had a different feel in the garden, where every hour seemed to stretch just a little longer, where every movement felt more purposeful, more real. The rest of the world, with its noise and chaos, was distant, as though it belonged to someone else. Fran's hands, weathered but steady, worked methodically. She tugged at the stubborn weeds that had crept between the rose bushes, their thick roots digging into the earth like something they owned. She pulled them out one by one, her fingers scraping against the soil, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the act, as though she were pulling out all the things in her life that had tried to choke out the beauty, the things that had tried to take over when she wasn't looking. With every weed she removed, the air felt cleaner, the garden a little more hers. She stood, wiped the dirt from her hands onto her jeans, and surveyed the garden. The roses, in all their tangled splendor, had once been Henry's pride, his hands carefully tending to each plant, ensuring they grew strong. Now they were hers, but in a way, they always had been. Her fingers brushed over a few soft petals, a quiet touch to the life that had once been shared between them. The roses hadn't been easy, but they were resilient. They had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, just like she had. And now, with everything that had happened with Melinda, with everything that had been taken from her, Fran felt the need to tend them more than ever. The garden, like her, needed to be nurtured, but it also needed boundaries. A car pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching under its tires. Fran didn't need to look up to know who it was. Chloe, her granddaughter, was home from school. Chloe had always been the bright spot in her life, the one who saw her for who she was, who had never asked her to shrink or be anyone else. Fran straightened up as Chloe walked toward her, a small bag of plant cuttings in her hand. The younger girl's eyes were bright, her expression eager as she approached, the sunlight catching the strands of her hair. "Look, Grandma, we're learning how to propagate roses in class today," Chloe said, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and the quiet wonder that only youth could bring. She handed Fran the bag with the cuttings, the stems carefully wrapped in damp paper. "I thought we could try it here." Fran smiled, taking the cuttings from her granddaughter's hand. She could feel the warmth of Chloe's touch in the moment, the same warmth that seemed to fill the space between them. "We'll give it a try," Fran replied, her voice soft but steady. "A rose can grow anywhere, if you know how to treat it." Together they knelt down in the soft earth, Fran guiding Chloe's hands as she carefully cut the stems to just the right length. The simple act of tending to something, nurturing it into life, felt grounding, like it was something Fran could hold on to in a world that had so recently upended. She taught Chloe the techniques, how to trim the cuttings just right, how to dip them in rooting hormone, how to plant them deep enough to take root but not too deep. The simplicity of it, the rhythm of the task, gave Fran a quiet peace. She had always loved teaching, but teaching Chloe was different. There was a connection there that couldn't be broken, not like with Melinda. As they worked, Ellie appeared in the garden, a pitcher of sweet tea in her hand. She approached with her usual no-nonsense stride, setting the pitcher down on the stone table under the large oak tree. "Thought you might need this," she said, her tone light but her eyes thoughtful. Fran smiled, grateful for her old friend's presence. "Thanks, Ellie." Ellie pulled a chair over and sat, folding her arms across her chest as she looked at the garden. "You've been busy," she commented, nodding toward the rows of new plants Fran had been tending. "I had some things to clear away," Fran replied, brushing the sweat from her brow. Ellie's gaze shifted toward the roses, the ones Chloe had helped her propagate. "What's the opposite of being erased?" she asked suddenly, her tone shifting, a quiet wisdom in her words. Fran paused for a moment, then answered, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything that had happened. "Rooted." Ellie nodded slowly, as though she understood exactly what Fran meant. "Exactly. Those roses won't forget where they come from, and neither will you." Fran looked down at the rose bushes again, the cuttings now nestled in the rich soil. She reached out, running her fingers over the tender new growth. There was a kind of stubborn beauty in this. Life pushing through the cracks, defying the things that tried to destroy it. "Do you think it'll work?" Chloe asked, looking up at her with wide eyes. Fran met her granddaughter's gaze, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. "We'll see. But I think it will." Chloe smiled, nodding, and together they stood to step back and admire their work. As they did, Fran noticed something she hadn't before. There, at the edge of the garden, she saw a small plaque she hadn't noticed in years. It was old, weathered, but still readable. The inscription, faded by time, read, "To be remembered." Chloe's eyes caught it too. "Grandma, do you remember when Grandpa put that there?" Fran nodded, her gaze softening. "I do. He wanted the garden to always be something we could return to. A place where we could remember everything that mattered." Chloe looked at Fran, her expression serious. "Then it's not just about the flowers, is it?" "No," Fran said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's about the roots." The envelope sat on the kitchen counter, its yellowed edges crinkling slightly as Fran ran her fingers over it. The contents had been carefully stowed away for years, buried beneath layers of memory and the daily chaos of life. But today, she needed it. Today, she had to confront the truth once again. She had been planning to go through it later, when the pain of the past few weeks would have had a little more time to settle. But as she stared at the envelope, she felt a shift in her resolve. No more waiting. No more letting the past slip away while the present burns. It was time to finish this. The file inside was heavy, filled with medical documents and forms, the kind of paperwork that had always made Fran feel like a cog in the machine, lost among names and numbers. But there was one document she was looking for: her living will, her directive, the one that had been drawn up years ago when Henry had still been alive, when Melinda was still the daughter she trusted implicitly. Fran's hands trembled as she opened the file, flipping past the insurance papers, the old hospital bills, and the medical power of attorney. And then she found it. Her health directive, the one that listed Melinda as her health proxy. Melinda, Fran thought, her heart tightening in her chest, the same woman who had shoved me aside in front of the entire church. The same woman who had never understood the true meaning of family. But something felt off as she scanned the document. The name at the top, the one listed as the person responsible for her health decisions, was not Melinda's. It was Ellie's. What? Fran blinked, scanning the page again, disbelief rippling through. Her. Ellie? She had known about the update, of course. Raymond had suggested making Ellie the executor of her estate months ago, given Melinda's behavior, but this was something different. This was her health proxy, something far more personal. Fran's stomach clenched as the pieces fell into place. Melinda had no right to this anymore. She never had. Fran set the document down slowly, the weight of it pressing on her chest like a lead balloon. She didn't have to look for the next piece of the puzzle. The phone call from the doctor's office had already confirmed her suspicion. Melinda had contacted the office pretending to be Fran's proxy, demanding access to her medical records and making decisions that she had no right to make. Her hands shook now, but with a different kind of fury. She reached for the phone and dialed Raymond's number. When he answered, his voice was calm but cautious. "Fran." "I need you to help me, Raymond," she said, her voice colder than it had ever been. "Melinda's trying to steal what's mine." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, but Fran could hear the shift in Raymond's tone. "What's happened?" "She contacted my doctor's office, pretending to be me, pretending to be my health proxy." Raymond's response was immediate. "That's illegal. I'll take care of it. You need to file a report with the Patient Advocate Board immediately." "I already did," Fran replied, her voice hardening with every word. "The moment I found out, I filed it." "But this isn't over, Raymond." She's pushed me to the edge. The line was silent for a long moment before Raymond spoke again. I'll make sure this gets handled. I'm sorry you're going through this. Fran didn't respond to his sympathy. It felt too late for that. As she hung up, her phone buzzed. A message from Greg. I'm sorry, she's spiraling. Please just talk to her. She doesn't know what she's doing. Fran stared at the screen for a long moment, her finger hovering over the keyboard. She could feel the anger and the betrayal building in her chest again, the memory of that moment at the church. The way Melinda had turned her back on her without so much as a second thought. She typed slowly, her words deliberate, cutting. Too late for soft men and slow regrets. She hit send, the finality of it settling deep inside her. There was no more room for Melinda in her life, no more space for the lies or the manipulation. Fran turned back to the kitchen counter, the documents still spread out in front of her. The phone buzzed again, but this time, she didn't check it. She didn't need to. The storm that had been brewing for weeks, the one she had tried to ignore, was no longer something to weather. It was here, and it wasn't going anywhere. Fran glanced out the window toward the garden, where the roses were already starting to bloom. The delicate petals were a reminder of something beautiful that had survived, despite everything. Despite the neglect, the weeds, the harshness of time. Rooted, she thought again, her heart hardening. The storm wouldn't take her down. Not this time. She had been rooted long before any of this had started, and nothing would make her forget that. The church was quiet as the congregation slowly settled into their seats, the hushed murmur of voices a faint backdrop to the reverence that lingered in the air. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting vibrant hues of red and gold onto the pews, bathing the room in a sense of something sacred, something that belonged to the past. It was a place where Fran had spent years, decades of her life. But today, it felt different. Today, it felt like a battleground. Chloe stood at the front of the church, her hands trembling slightly as she held the speech she had written for this moment. The entire congregation was watching her, their eyes fixed on the young girl who had been raised in the shadow of a fractured family, who had witnessed the unraveling of something that was supposed to be whole. Yet, despite everything, Chloe's voice remained steady, her words clear and full of purpose. Honor doesn't come from money, she began, her voice carrying through the hushed room. It comes from how you treat people, how you make them feel seen, how you show them respect. True honor is not measured by what we leave behind, but by the love we give while we're here. Fran sat in the front row, her heart pounding as she listened to her granddaughter speak. Chloe's words were simple, but they cut through the room with the precision of truth. Every syllable felt like a declaration, a testament to everything Fran had tried to teach her over the years, the very lesson she had failed to pass on to her own daughter, Melinda. The congregation listened in silence, absorbing the weight of Chloe's words. And then, as if on cue, the applause began. A few hesitant claps at first, but soon they grew into something warmer, something more genuine. The sound filled the room, but Fran didn't hear it. All she could hear was the lump in her throat, the tightness in her chest, and the way her eyes stung with the sudden rush of emotion. She had worked so hard to teach her daughter these lessons, but it was Chloe who had learned them, who had understood what it meant to be truly seen. Fran's hand reached up to her face, and before she could stop herself, a tear slipped down her cheek. Melinda, sitting a few rows behind her, was unmoving. Her face was frozen in a tight, expressionless mask, her hands folded in her lap. The applause seemed to wash over her, but she didn't react. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She sat there, like a statue, watching as her daughter, delivered a message that hit too close to home. The words were a mirror, a reflection of everything Melinda had ignored, everything she had chosen not to see. Fran didn't look at Melinda. She didn't need to. She could feel the distance, the icy gap that had grown between them, and she knew that whatever was left between them had already died. Ellie, sitting beside Fran, leaned in slightly, her voice a whisper against the growing sound of the congregation's applause. "You built that voice," she said, her words low but sharp with recognition. Fran turned to Ellie, her heart swelling with something like gratitude. But she didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Ellie understood. They both understood. As the clapping died down, the pastor stood and made his way toward Fran. His face was warm with a quiet kind of admiration, and when he reached her, he placed a hand on her shoulder. His words were soft, but full of meaning. "That's the kind of daughter we all want," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The kind of daughter who understands what it means to truly honor." Fran swallowed, blinking back the tears that had gathered in her eyes. Her lips trembled as she nodded, but the words didn't come. She had always wanted Melinda to be that daughter, the one who could stand with grace and strength, who could rise above the petty things and see the truth. But it was Chloe who had done it. Chloe, who had always seen her, always understood her. As the service continued, Fran sat back, her heart heavy with pride for Chloe, but also for herself. She had made it. She had survived the storm that Melinda had brought into her life. She had weathered the worst, and she had come out the other side. But then, just as the pastor began to move away, Fran caught sight of Melinda out of the corner of her eye. Melinda was standing, her face a mask of something unreadable, and before Fran could process what was happening, her daughter turned and walked out of the church, her steps quick and purposeful, leaving the warmth of the congregation behind. Fran's heart skipped a beat, a heavy thud in her chest. Melinda didn't even glance back. Too late, Fran thought, the ache settling deep into her bones. It wasn't just the apology that was missing, it was the love, the understanding, the ability to see the truth when it was right in front of her. But Fran had learned a hard lesson today. Some things can't be fixed. Some things are beyond saving. The door to the church closed softly behind Melinda, and in the silence that followed, Fran realized that this was the final goodbye. The weight of the pen in Fran's hand felt oddly heavy, as though it carried more than just ink on paper. She sat at the small desk in the corner of her living room, the late afternoon light streaming in through the window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that was familiar, but felt like it was settling into something permanent now. A soft hum from the kitchen, the last of the lemon bars cooling on the counter, was the only sound that filled the room. Fran had spent the better part of an hour staring at the blank sheet of paper in front of her. The words had been there, swirling in her mind, but it was the act of putting them down, of committing them to the page, that had held her back. There had been too many years of silence, too many years of playing the role of the good mother, the good wife, the woman who always did what was expected. Now, she had to explain herself. She had to make it clear. She took a deep breath and began to write. To my church family, I've spent much of my life thinking I understood what it meant to give, to sacrifice, to be a part of something greater than myself. I raised my family with love and care, always doing what I believed was right, always putting others before myself. But life has a way of showing us things we don't always want to see. Fran paused, her hand trembling for a moment. She looked at the words she'd written, but they didn't feel final yet. She wasn't naming names. She didn't need to. The people who read this letter would understand. They knew the story without her needing to say it. In recent months, I've come to realize that not all sacrifices are honored. Not all love is returned. Not all actions are met with gratitude. There comes a time when we have to let go of the people who can't see us for who we truly are, the ones who dismiss us, erase us, as though we never mattered. Chloe stood beside her, leaning over Fran's shoulder as she looked at the words forming on the page. She hadn't said much during the process of writing. She didn't need to. Her presence, the quiet solidarity she gave, was enough. When Fran finished the last line, Chloe helped her format the letter, smoothing the edges with a practiced touch, aligning the text neatly. The final paragraph was the hardest, the one that would explain everything without explaining anything at all. As I move forward, I've made decisions that reflect what I believe is best for me and for the future. I've decided to update my will to reflect the people who've truly shown me what it means to love without conditions. This change may be difficult for some, but it is a decision that has been made with clarity and purpose. I am grateful to all who have been part of my life, and I will continue to treasure the moments we shared. Fran sat back, her eyes scanning the letter one last time. Chloe's fingers brushed over the paper, almost reverently. "You did it," Chloe said softly, her voice steady but with a note of pride. She didn't need to add more. Her eyes spoke volumes. Fran picked up the letter and slipped it into the envelope. It felt final now, the act of sending it off, of letting the world know what she had done and why she had done it. It was no longer just a decision. It was part of her legacy. Ellie's voice broke through the stillness. She was standing by the door holding a glass of sweet tea in her hand, her eyes soft with understanding. "You just built the kind of obituary people write before death," Ellie remarked, her voice filled with a quiet recognition. Fran looked at Ellie, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe. But it's the truth," she said quietly. The phone buzzed on the table beside her, a harsh interruption to the calm. Fran glanced at the screen. It was Greg. Her hand hovered over the phone, and for a moment, she hesitated. He'd been trying to reach her for days, his apologies flooding her voicemail, his texts a steady stream of guilt. He'd asked her to forgive Melinda, to give her another chance, to understand what Melinda was going through. Fran pressed the button to answer the call. She brought the phone to her ear, the weight of the moment settling over her like a fog. "Fran, Greg's voice cracked. "I'm sorry, she's spiraling and I can't get through to her. Please, you have to, I've already heard enough, Greg," Fran said, her voice colder than she intended. The words tasted final, and she couldn't bring herself to soften them. "I've had enough." There was a brief silence, and then a crackling, desperate apology from Greg, but Fran had already turned the phone off, already cut the line between them. The words had been said. The decisions had been made. Fran placed the phone back down and looked over at Raymond's message on the screen. "The files are updated, ironclad and documented." She nodded to herself. This was it. The path she had set for herself was clear, and nothing was going to change that. She stood up, crossing the room to the window, looking out at the garden where the roses had begun to bloom. There was a quiet satisfaction in watching the world outside, knowing that the things that mattered most had been secured. And as the evening light faded, Fran knew that she would keep growing, keep rooting herself deeper, no matter what storms came next. The future was in her hands now. The afternoon sunlight was soft, but persistent, spilling across the floor as Fran moved through the house with deliberate steps, as though each action was a quiet farewell. The house was still, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. But today, it was the silence of something winding down, the end of an era, her era. In the small guest room, Fran stood with a cardboard box at her feet. It had been sitting there for days, half open, waiting. The room, once a welcoming space for friends and family, felt empty now. Its walls, lined with photos and mementos from times when Melinda still visited, seemed to close in around her. The bed was neatly made, the pillows fluffed, the room untouched, save for the scattered items Fran had started to box up. She ran her fingers over a small ceramic trophy that sat on the shelf, a piece of Melinda's childhood. The edges of the award were chipped from years of neglect, a relic of a time when Melinda had excelled at everything, when she had been the center of Fran's world. But now, the trophy was just another item to be packed away, another part of the past to be put in storage, far from her life. Fran placed it gently into the box, her movements slow, almost reverent, as though the act of packing it away was its own kind of funeral. She moved to the corner of the room, where an old photo album rested on the dresser. Melinda had been so young in these photos, innocent, smiling, unaware of how the years would shape her, unaware of how their relationship would fray with every unspoken word, every unseen action. Everything is changing, Fran murmured under her breath, her fingers brushing over a photograph of Melinda at her high school graduation. There had been a time when Melinda's accomplishments had filled Fran with pride, when she had been the one to cheer her daughter on, to help her navigate through the difficult moments of life. But those moments felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone far removed from the woman Melinda had become. Melinda's childhood trophies and awards were the next to go. Fran carried them from the shelf and placed them one by one into the box, her mind drifting to the past. The ribbons, the certificates, the little moments of triumph that had once seemed so important. But in this moment, in this place, they no longer mattered. Not to Fran. She was no longer that mother. She was no longer the woman who lived for Melinda's approval, the woman who sacrificed her own needs to keep peace. The box began to fill, but the weight of it all grew heavier as Fran moved to the guest room closet. She hesitated before she opened the door, the cold, musty air hitting her face. Melinda's old things, clothes, books, memories, were tucked away here, as though they had never really left. Fran reached for the clothes, the ones Melinda had left behind when she moved out. The ones that had once filled this closet with the smell of her daughter's youth. But now, those clothes felt like remnants of a life she no longer knew. With a heavy heart, Fran picked them up and folded them carefully, placing them in the box alongside the rest of Melinda's past. Then, as if the weight of the finality of it all pressed on her, Fran turned the key in the lock of the guest room door. The sound of the lock clicking shut was louder than it should have been, filling the empty space with a feeling of permanence. She stood there for a moment, her hand still on the door, her mind racing with the knowledge that once the door was closed, there was no going back. "I can't keep pretending," Fran whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. She moved away from the door, her steps steady as she headed to her office. Her computer sat on the desk, still open from earlier in the day. She sat down, hands resting lightly on the keyboard, and began the task she had been putting off, updating her passwords, her security settings, everything that would remove Melinda's access from her life. It was one more thing to do, one more thing to set the boundaries that had been long overdue. As Fran typed in her new passwords, confirming the updates, she felt a strange sense of clarity. Each click was a reminder of the choices she had made, of the life she was taking control of. Her hands, once so steady, now felt a little more confident. There would be no more surprises, no more crossing lines. But then the phone rang, breaking her reverie. It was a name she hadn't expected. Melinda's. Fran stared at the phone, the sudden rush of anger bubbling up inside her. The temptation to ignore it was overwhelming, but her finger hovered over the answer button. She didn't need to hear the apology, the excuses, the half-hearted attempts to fix what had been broken. Chloe's voice broke through the stillness of the room, calm and steady. "Does it hurt?" Fran looked at her granddaughter, who had quietly appeared in the doorway, watching her with a soft understanding in her eyes. The question hung in the air, so simple, yet so profound. Did it hurt? Fran blinked, swallowing the lump in her throat. Yes, she said, her voice tight. It hurts more than I thought it would. But there was a strength in the hurt, a resolve that was taking root in her heart. This was the last step, the last thing to close. The door to the past had been locked. And Fran, at last, had moved forward. Fran's hand hovered over the pen, its weight insignificant compared to the gravity of the task ahead. The final estate addendum sat before her, an innocent-looking sheet of paper, but the act of signing it would strip away something once vital, something once deeply cherished. Melinda's name, written neatly and proudly years ago, now felt like a ghost on the page. The woman who had once been her pride, her legacy, was nothing but a name in the past. A name that didn't deserve to be part of her future. With a steady hand, Fran signed the document. The ink was sharp, crisp, final. Melinda's name was removed. Fran stared at the page for a moment, the words sinking in. This wasn't just a legal action. This was a declaration of what could no longer exist. Fran had spent her life building something for her daughter, and now, in this one moment, she was unbuilding it, piece by piece. Every line where Melinda's name had once appeared was now blank, wiped clean by Fran's own hand. The room was silent except for the faint click of the pen as Fran set it down. Ellie, standing beside her, had not said a word during the process, but now she looked at Fran, her eyes steady, unwavering. She understood. "You're sure?" Ellie asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of both support and understanding. She had been with Fran every step of the way, watching as the woman who had once nurtured her family was forced to let go of the people who had betrayed her. Fran nodded, her expression hard but resolute. "It's done." She paused, glancing at the document one last time before she slid it into the envelope. "This is the last step. The final line." Ellie remained quiet, but Fran could feel the strength in her presence. She had been there for the difficult decisions, for the quiet moments when Fran had wavered. But this was something different. This was the end of a chapter that could never be rewritten. Fran's thoughts shifted briefly to the church. She had thought long and hard about the scholarship fund that would bear her name, a fund that would be given in Chloe's honor. Chloe, her granddaughter, the one who had truly understood her, the one who had carried the lessons Fran had tried to pass on. Chloe deserved this. Fran pulled another document from the stack, her fingers skimming over the text. It was a simple letter to the church, a directive for the donation of a scholarship fund. It was to be a legacy, but it wasn't a legacy of broken promises. It wasn't one that would be squandered. She carefully signed the document with a flourish, the finality of it bringing a sense of peace she hadn't expected. The church would donate the scholarship fund in Fran's name, and Chloe would be its first recipient. The church, a place that had once been a symbol of family for Fran, would now serve as a reminder that true honor could be found in the people who understood the real meaning of family. There was no need to elaborate on the details. Chloe's name would forever be tied to this gesture, her future sealed in a way that would honor everything Fran had always believed in. A future not tainted by the betrayal of a woman who couldn't see beyond her own needs. Fran looked over at Raymond, who had been silently waiting for her to finish. "Everything's in place," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He glanced down at the file, then met her gaze. "It's ironclad and documented." Fran nodded, the weight of the moment settling over her, but it wasn't a burden. It was liberation. The storm that had raged inside her for so long was finally clearing. Raymond carefully placed the addendum into its envelope, sealing it with a soft snap. Then, as Fran watched, he slid the envelope into the file and handed it to her. Fran took it, feeling the cool weight of it in her hands. "One last thing," she said, her voice steady. Reaching for the fireproof cabinet beside her desk, Fran carefully unlocked it and slid the file inside. The cabinet clicked shut with a finality that echoed in her chest. She turned back to Raymond and Ellie, the gravity of the situation heavy in the air, but somehow she felt lighter. Ellie broke the silence, her voice quieter now, tinged with the wisdom of years. "You've done what you had to do. It's over." Fran nodded, but there was something more than peace in her eyes now. There was resolve. She had fought for years to keep her family together, to make it whole. But sometimes, the cost of keeping something whole meant that you had to break it first. As Fran stood there, surrounded by the people who truly mattered, she realized that no matter how much had been lost, there were still things she had gained. True loyalty, true love, things that could never be taken away. And in that moment, she knew. The storm that had threatened to tear her apart was over. What remained was rooted in truth. And nothing, not even Melinda, could change that. She was finally free. The kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread, the comforting, warm scent wrapping around Fran like an old, familiar embrace. She moved through her morning rituals without haste, kneading dough, pulling cookies from the oven, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. There was no rush, no deadlines, just the quiet satisfaction of routine. It was a slow dance of normalcy, a rhythm that had always been hers, but now it felt different. The house, once filled with the weight of unresolved tension, now hummed with peace. For the first time in ages, the world outside felt distant, like something that no longer demanded her attention. She hadn't posted anything on social media for weeks. No carefully curated photos of family gatherings, no updates about the things that mattered most. The silence of her phone was a gift she hadn't realized she'd been longing for. She poured herself a cup of tea, the steam rising in delicate tendrils, and carried it to the window. The garden outside, where the roses had bloomed in stubborn defiance, was thriving. The weeds she had once so carefully removed had stayed away. The soil was rich, the plants healthy. Everything felt rooted, everything in its place. Chloe came by every week now, always with something homemade. A loaf of bread, a jar of jam, a freshly baked pie. The visits were quiet, but filled with understanding. The house felt full when Chloe was there, even in the quietest moments. They didn't need words to fill the space. They simply sat, ate, and listened to the hum of the world around them. The front door opened, and Fran's eyes turned to see Chloe walking into the living room, her usual smile lighting up her face. She was carrying a basket of freshly baked scones, still warm, the scent of cinnamon and sugar filling the room before she even set them down. "Grandma," Chloe greeted, her voice bright. But the underlying softness was always there, the tenderness they had shared now part of their rhythm. She placed the basket on the table and sat beside Fran, the familiar, unspoken bond between them settling comfortably between the cracks of the silence. "Just in time for tea," Fran said, her voice steady, with that quiet warmth that always lived in the spaces between them. Chloe smiled and poured herself a cup, taking her usual spot by the window. They didn't always speak, but the quiet felt full, and that, for Fran, was enough. There were no more demands, no more expectations, no apologies, just the weight of a life rebuilt, slowly and intentionally. The house was quieter now, in ways that went beyond just the absence of Melinda's presence. The noise, the distractions, the things that had once consumed her thoughts, now felt distant. The house was whole again, not because everything was perfect, but because Fran had learned the art of preservation. She had learned to hold on to what mattered and to let go of the rest. Ellie came by later in the day, bringing with her a simple frame and a quiet smile. "I thought you might want this," she said, setting the framed photo of the church photo down on the mantel. The edges of the picture had been carefully cropped, and there, at the center, was a smiling Fran, arms around Chloe, just the two of them, caught in a moment of calm. Fran looked at the photo, her eyes softening as she studied it. It wasn't the perfect image of a family that had once been, but it was the image of a family that was. It wasn't Melinda. It wasn't Greg. And it didn't have to be. It was real. It was enough. Fran chuckled softly, the laugh surprising her as it bubbled up. It felt strange, an unfamiliar sound after everything she'd been through. But the laugh was there, and it felt good. Then, as quickly as it came, the laughter faded, and a tear slipped down Fran's cheek. "You okay?" Ellie asked, her voice low and understanding. Fran wiped the tear away, looking at the photo again. "I'm more than okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm finally at peace." The room was still as Ellie leaned back, her gaze on the photo. There was no need for more words. They both understood. This was a quiet victory. It wasn't a win anyone else could see, but it was the one that mattered most. The phone buzzed on the table beside Fran. She reached for it, expecting nothing, but when she saw the name on the screen, Raymond, her heart skipped a beat. She picked it up, swiping to answer. "Fran." Raymond's voice came through, smooth and professional. "The documents are complete. Everything is locked down. She's locked out of everything." Fran took a deep breath, the finality of the words settling over her. The storm was over. The last piece was in place. "Thank you, Raymond," Fran said quietly, her voice steady now. "I'm ready." The line went quiet, and then Raymond spoke again, his voice gentler now. "You're free." She hung up, placing the phone down with a deep exhale. She looked around the room, Chloe sitting across from her, Ellie by her side, and knew that no matter what the future held, it would be hers to shape. It had always been hers, but now she had finally reclaimed it. The house, her home, was quiet, whole, and Fran, for the first time in years, was truly free. The house was quiet, but there was a hum in the air, the kind of quiet that holds the weight of everything unsaid. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the window, casting shadows across the hardwood floors, and Fran sat at her kitchen table, her favorite quilt folded beside her. The quilt was one of the few things left that had not been affected by the changes in her life, the things she had held onto in a world that had been nothing but shifting sand. The will lay before her, the final piece of a puzzle she had been working on for months. It was simple, clean. It wasn't a grand gesture. There were no flowery words or excessive bequests. Just the truth, the way it had always been meant to be. She picked up the pen, its weight heavy in her hand, but there was no hesitation. She knew exactly what she was doing. The past had been cleared away. The lines had been drawn, and now she was finishing what had to be done. Chloe would inherit everything. The house, the heirlooms, the savings. Everything that Fran had worked for, everything that had once been meant for Melinda, was now Chloe's. She had earned it. Not by blood alone, but by the kindness and strength she had shown when everyone else turned away. Chloe was the only one who had truly seen her, understood her, and for that, she was the one who deserved everything. Melinda, on the other hand, was gone from this legacy. Her name didn't appear anywhere. Not a line, not a mention. She had shown Fran her true self in the moments that mattered most, and in the end, Fran had nothing left for her but silence. Fran signed her name at the bottom of the page, the ink flowing effortlessly, sealing the decision. There was no regret, only a quiet satisfaction, the feeling that the future was now in the hands of someone who would understand what it meant to honor the past, not erase it. The will was complete. Next came the obituary. Fran had drafted it herself. It wasn't anything grand or dramatic, Just a few simple words to mark her passing. But there was one line in particular that had stayed with her, one that she knew had to be included. A line that would tell the world what Melinda had failed to see, what Fran had always known. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she typed it. She passed with peace, and without apology. The words felt like a quiet victory. Fran had been fighting for her peace for years, and now, at last, it was hers. She had given so much of herself to the wrong people. She had sacrificed for a daughter who had turned her back on her, who had never understood the true meaning of love or respect. But now, the last part of her story was written, and it was hers to tell. Chloe had already read the draft. Ellie had read it too. Both of them had agreed. It was the truth. There was no need for anything more. The rest was just noise. Fran placed the paper in an envelope, folded neatly, and set it aside. The weight of it felt final. This would be her last word, the last thing she would leave behind. But it wasn't about the money, or the house, or even the heirlooms. It was about who she had become, and who she was leaving behind. She had taught Chloe well. She had taught her to be strong, to be kind, and to never back down when the truth needed to be spoken. She stood and walked to the mantel where the framed photo of the church scene still sat. She had asked Ellie to crop it for her, to remove the unnecessary faces, the ones who had never truly seen her. Now it was just her and Chloe, captured in a moment that belonged only to them. Fran's gaze lingered on the photo for a moment, her lips curling into a small, bittersweet smile. The photo, the will, the letter, they were all pieces of the same truth. She had been erased once, but she had come back. The final step was done. Fran placed the will, along with the obituary, in her fireproof cabinet, a small smile tugging at her lips as she closed the door with a quiet click. Chloe would come over later, as she always did, and they would sit together in the quiet. No more words needed. The house, her home, felt complete now. Whole in a way that nothing had been in a long time. It wasn't just the absence of Melinda that made it whole. It was the presence of those who truly understood. The storm had passed, and Fran, at last, was free. The last line of her will, her final defiant act, stayed with her as she sat back down in the living room. At church, my daughter shoved me aside for a photo, so I cropped her out of my will. For the first time in a long time, Fran felt lighter. Nothing, no one, could ever take her peace again.